In these uncertain times, creating and curating within and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. This audio essay was recorded by Andrea Karlsén in May 2021. The essay is based on a report with the same name produced in connection to my examination from Kulturverkstan, Gothenburg. If you want to get in touch or have questions about the essay, please email me at kontakt@andreakarlsen.se. And that's contact in Swedish with K's instead of C's. kontakt@andreakarlsen.se. Happy listening.
What to make of all this is uncertain. We've been burnt, and I feel a kind of skepticism towards the customs we try to re-engage with now, whether it's celebrating a new year or planning a new project. But living with the uncertainty, moving ahead in the midst of uncertainty, is a lesson to be learned in this part of the world. The times will change, that idols will fall, is the only thing we can know for sure.
In a recent issue of the Swedish art magazine Paletten, the artist Santiago Mostyn voices skepticism of the ways we're trying to re-engage with the state of normalcy after this pandemic. Because what constitutes a normal state? What is normal for whom, in which context? The only true certainty is uncertainty. Even so, I would like to try to make sense of something in these uncertain times. In this essay, I aim to analyze in which way the COVID-19 pandemic influenced creative and curatorial processes and how we can understand the changing working conditions that may follow in the pandemic's shadow. I will present examples of projects that took place during the pandemic with voices from Sweden, the United Kingdom, Turkey, and Greece. As the pandemic is global, we need to look at the issue at the global scale. The disease was present in many areas, but the discussions around it and the methods developed to handle it vary. These new methods are not only fit for handling challenges to the cultural sector in a pandemic, but should often have benefits down the line. At the same time, it is important to not paint too rosy a picture of this gruesome situation. The essay does not argue for or against any method, nor does it intend to create a utopian view of this time, because we are facing a hard reality in the pandemic. According to a recent report from UNESCO, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a worldwide, monumental impact on the cultural and creative sector. The crisis had an immediate effect on income opportunities and business networking opportunities, as well as making it harder to reach audiences in alternative manners. The crisis also affected cultural workers differently. The venue visitor-based subsectors, such as the performing arts and the heritage sector, were hit especially hard. Reports from Kultur Norden are similar. In the Nordic countries, many cultural workers experience increased uncertainty about the future work and income situation. Surveys from both Finland, Sweden, and Norway also shows that a significant proportion of these workers want to change their line of work. But how did we navigate and manage the circumstances that the COVID-19 pandemic brought with it? And what can we learn from creating and curating in these uncertain times? Chapter 1. The hybrid model. I base my analysis on two different materials, a web survey I created for this purpose and a webinar I attended on Zoom in April 2021. The webinar was organized by Open Space, an international platform for experimental initiatives and creative commissions. The invited speakers were representatives from different independent cultural and creative organizations from Athens, Istanbul, and London. I can distinguish one overarching theme in my collected material, and that's the increased use of new digital tools in art production and distribution. The digital format also comes with unexpected positive ramifications, like experiencing new productive ways of time management, as well as helping cultural and creative sectors to become more conscious about their environmental impact. One participant in my report, the artist Uta Kögelsberger, produced Fire Complex during the pandemic. Kögelsberger was deeply impacted by the California wildfires during 2020, which almost destroyed 170,000 acres of ancient forest in the Western Sierras. In Fire Complex, Kögelsberger photo and video documented the clearing of dead trees in this area. An Instagram account was created to publicize the resulting artworks, as well as raise awareness about the disaster. The Instagram account is coupled with the circulation of the works on public, digital and paper billboards in London, with the billboards moving to Los Angeles and San Francisco in July 2021. The whole motivation, Kögelsberger writes, was to make a real-life difference to a specific environment. The work that exists in the public realm to date is a means of raising funds to help organizations replant trees and prevent future fires. Before the pandemic, Kögelsberger was resistant to social media, but recognized that a project like Fire Complex will need to reach audiences beyond the gallery walls if it is to have a visible impact on the reforestation of the Western Sierras. We can see the same newfound openness to the digital format from the Athens-based curator Augustus Veinoglou, founder of Sneta Residency. Veinoglou said that after the initial shock, the pandemic allowed the organization to take a step back and evaluate the work that had been done up until that point. In reflecting on how Sneta Residency could integrate their former activities into the new conditions, they saw the possibility to be playful with their formats. With this experimental approach, they, for example, created an immersive app with VR technology to be used in a virtual exhibition called Back Home. Veinoglou said the organization is thinking of keeping some of these new methods after the pandemic and adds, "We will get back to some formal structure, but I don't think we will ever be the same, and I'm glad about that." Another hybrid way of working in the pandemic can be seen in a project called Untitled, which was initiated by Göteborgs Konsthall at the beginning of the pandemic. They commissioned some 10 artists to produce new artworks. The only conditions was that the artists would be able to finish their works despite the restrictions in place at the time, and that the finished work could be presented physically at Göteborgs Konsthall. Untitled, one of the participant writes, was formulated so they could continue to support new artistic production, economically support artists, and keep the discussion about art alive in a very strained time. The participant also writes about how they in Untitled had to be more flexible and fluid in the working process than before. The focus was less on results and more about the processes in themselves. The artists did not have to be present at Göteborgs Konsthall during the preparations, and this, the participant reflects, may open up to new ways of strengthening their climate work. Untitled has showed that the organization has to reflect on which situations collaborators need to be physically present and not. For Selenk Bafra, curator and director of Saha in Istanbul, the pandemic pushed them to think creatively concerning how to take care of their artists completing residencies at Saha. They corresponded with artists in quarantine through video letters, letting them do Instagram takeovers, as well as continuously updating and reaching out to the residency participants and Saha's alumni. Bafra also said that they would like to continue their residency program, both physically as well as digitally, for those artists that don't have the opportunity to travel to Istanbul because they feel, and I quote, very adapted to this hybrid way of working. The turn to digital tools and the wish to keep using them in the future were evident in my report. All of the participants write that they have employed new methods like live streaming events and using Instagram and Facebook for art exhibitions and other pedagogical programs. Some of them has worked more consciously with the digital tools and in this discovered positive ramifications, like aiding them in new methods of time management, as well as helping the participants to think more consciously about their environmental impact. But how can we understand these results in a broader context? Chapter 2: Counterpublics, Art, and the Rush to the Digital. The artist and curator Marion van Osten has written about the importance of cultural institutions as places where ideas around publicness, justice, and societal issues can be formulated and discussed. Van Osten argues that cultural institutions are filled with specific historic and symbolic framings. They can be seen as public spheres, crucial in shaping our understandings of cultural norms and societal values. The focus of inquiry for von Osten is the relationship between the art public and counter-public. Specific types of publics that act as discursive arenas where members of subordinated social groups can formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities and interests. We will return to the notion of counterpublics in the end of my analysis. For now, I would like to focus on the report Den förutsägbara kulturen, Corona, konst och kapitalism. In this, Matthias de Sack writes that the internet has become even more public than before the pandemic. He argues that you simply can't get COVID-19 when you are surfing the net. It is a safe zone. But to compare it to a live show is misleading, de Sack continues. When the show moves to digital platforms, the conditions for the performance change. The platform brings a variety of safety issues concerning personal integrity and copyright ownership. Depending on where you live, different levels of state censorship may also come into play. De Sack writes that the rush to the digital also puts pressure on cultural workers to view the crisis as an opportunity. But it is difficult to be experimental with your resources when the margins are narrow. If digital solutions are to be implemented on a wider scale, de Sack argues, the political support has to follow and ensure the financial security of the institutions that choose to develop these tools in the future. The report also raises questions about the possible economical effect a shift to the digital can bring. If we move our operations to commercially driven platforms, it may influence the standard economical model in Sweden for arts and culture, which strongly depends on public funds. The concern for what kind of effect the increased use of digital tools has on society is shared by the curator and artist Paul B. Preciado. Preciado writes in the international art magazine Art Forum about the technological and societal impacts COVID-19 can bring by taking their point of departure from Michel Foucault's theories about biopolitics. For Foucault, all politics are biopolitics, not a given body in a biological sense, but as the political action of fabricating a body on which power can be exercised. Foucault argues that biopolitics can be viewed as a specific control apparatus which governments and modern nation-states use to be able to subjugate whole populations or masses of people. This apparatus has had success because, according to Foucault, the techniques of biopolitical government spread as a network of power that goes beyond the judicial spheres, which penetrates the entire territory of lived experience and each individual body. The subjected don't even know that they are subjected. This life feels like the normal state. Preciado argues that these apparatuses of control becomes intensified in times of uncertainty or crisis. We, more or less willingly, went into quarantine and watched as our societies became ghost towns. With many technological advances, like tracking people infected by the virus via mobile phones, the possibility to govern the public in the private has opened up even more than before. We accepted the digital platforms provided by governments and private corporations as the new stage in which we live our lives through. Because of this, Preciado writes, and I quote, "It is imperative to modify the relationship between our bodies and biovigilant machines of biocontrol. They are not only communication devices." So, the methods of managing the virus that is being tested on a global scale, Preciado continues, is a way of understanding sovereignty through biopolitics. I've talked about the idea of biopolitics as a societal power structure, but what about the actual biological body? Because even though biopolitics is a theory, it has critical consequences on real bodies. The art history professor Caroline A. Jones argues in an article in Art Forum that to understand the pandemic and its consequences, we also need to understand the ecological and biological relation between viruses and humans. Viruses are more likely to infect fast-growing cells in a population that is booming, Jones continues, because there are more hosts that can generate cycles of replication. But in a boom and bust dynamic, a virus's success as a pathogen will diminish as the hosts decline. Ecological virologists call this punishing the winner. By expanding and thriving to the extent the human species has done until now, we can be crowned the winner in the biological ecosystem. But that does not mean all humans are winning. If we look at a recent report from ICOM, International Council of Museums, almost all of the museums around the world will likely have to reduce their resources and activities as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Around 30% will downsize their permanent staff, and this percentage rises to around 45% for freelance and temporary contracts. More than 50% of the participants in ICOM's report think that their institutions will have to operate with reduced opening hours, and the data shows significant differences across regions, with more pronounced effects where museums are recent and few. In places with fragile societal structures, such as part of Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the consequences of the pandemic on the cultural and creative sectors seem to have hit the hardest. Geography professor Eugene McCann has described how the pandemic highlights the growing importance of public spaces, although with some reservations. I quote, "Looking for hope in publicness necessitates acknowledging its unevenness." In this, McCann argues, some people can choose when to be public, while dangerous publicness is forced upon others, and some are excluded altogether. McCann emphasizes that public spaces, in for example the Global South, are essential to the economic livelihoods of people with low income, often living in crowded contexts with inadequate housing. McCann also highlights that when different counterpublics, like the Black Lives Matter movement or Extinction Rebellion, lost access to public spaces during the pandemic, they organized online, And during the 20th century, the US feminist movement created counterpublics through a variety of cultural public platforms. So when talking about publicness, McCann argues, we should think broadly about the types of spaces and spatialities different publics constitute themselves in and through. McCann's arguments relate to Marion von Osten's ideas about cultural institutions as a place for different ideas of publics and counterpublics, showing how these questions have been discussed long before COVID-19. It may just be that right now, with so many affected at so many different places in the world, we may truly begin to understand the importance of free public spaces and the impact the cultural and creative sector can have on this development. Viruses has been within us before these uncertain times and will be transforming along with us going forward. But in the social, economical, and cultural politics formulated in the shadow of the pandemic, the risk of being left behind seems stronger for others than some. Conclusion: the need for a human language. We have seen that the new methods of curating and creating in a pandemic may bring unexpected positive ramifications, like using them more consciously to reach broader audiences, connect to others on a worldwide scale, or help in the fight against climate change. However, the rush to digitalization may also deepen the division between those institutions that have profound social and financial support from their communities and those that do not. We have also seen that in the aftermath of the pandemic, some theorists fear that authoritarian powers will obtain greater control over our individual lives as a result of the transition from physical to digital spaces. The precarious situation of those with vulnerabilities become even more precarious. I argue in this essay that the pandemic is pushing us towards new methods and techniques for curating and creating at large. The structures we are creating now may well be with us and can evolve beyond this specific pandemic, which is why we also need to be vigilant concerning how these new methods can benefit all of us, so no one is left behind in the rush. In light of the somewhat bleak conclusions, I would like to end this essay with the more comforting quote from Julianna, the editor of the art magazine Paletten.
If the pandemic has brought something good with it, it is the need of finding a new language through which we can speak about art, a language that is both sincerer and deeper and more aware of the inescapable wounds of being a human, wounds we share with language and art. Mental suffering and truth, melancholy and insight, art and life are more connected than ever.